Wednesday, July the 3rd, 2024. Let us gather together and experience the goodness of God. I'm Pastor Trey Comstock. We'll start with our scripture of the week, Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, and a piece by me entitled Stigmatized to Death. Then, Pastor Emily Larson and I will talk scripture, and more specifically, how we keep moving on to different and still troubling things to stigmatize people with. But first, a reading from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell down at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and came behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Telakum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up, began to walk around. She was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. We like these kind of stories when we let them stand as weird, abstract hang-ups from 2,000 years ago that we definitely never worry about. In 2012, I attended an academic conference on religion and HIV and AIDS at St. Paul's University in Limuru, Kenya. I played the role of dutifully listened graduate student in a room full of titans. One presentation still stands out in my mind. A pastor from South Africa spoke at length about his work as an HIV-positive religious leader and what it took to be so public about having the disease and maintain his standing in a faith community. His larger argument in that presentation and his work as an activist focused on driving down the stigma that people faced for being HIV positive. Even 4 decades into the pandemic, HIV still confers an aura of sexual impropriety, despite the fact that a huge percentage of new HIV infections, at this point in history, come via maternal-to-child transmission or from an uninfected spouse getting HIV from their HIV-positive spouse within the bounds of their marriage. Churches and religious leaders hold a lot of blame for establishing and perpetuating the stigma. And if the church wants to play a more positive role in helping people with HIV and AIDS, the church needs to do some repenting. Stigmatization kills people because rejection and the life of a social outcast takes some of the joy out of living. In the case of HIV and AIDS, the lack of motivation to live means a lack of motivation to take the medicines that keep the disease repressed. Our research showed that positive interactions with church led folks to take their meds and live longer. However, as an HIV-positive person, to have such an interaction, they would have to trust that they would not be judged, rejected, and put down because a virus had set up shop in their immune system. As a result of that lecture, at some point during my work in a small rural Kenyan village, I held a worship service specifically for the folks that came to our village's clinic to get their HIV meds. I have no memory of what I said to them, and it was probably terrible. Knowing that era of myself well, I probably preached on Romans 8, that nothing can separate you from the love of God, including HIV, that God doesn't reject you for having a disease. If I could go back now, 12 years later, and undo some of my early crimes against preaching, I would use these two healing miracles in Mark 5, because they give a much more concrete version of God loving across stigmatized social barriers. Leviticus 15:25 through 27 declares, "If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, for all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanliness, as in the days of her impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies during all the days of her discharge shall be treated as the bed of her impurity, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanliness of her impurity. Whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, and bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening." Numbers 19:14 states, "This is the law when someone dies in a tent. Everyone who comes in the tent, and everyone who is in the tent, shall be unclean for 7 days." Both of Christ's interactions impart uncleanliness. The woman with the 12-year-long hemorrhage touches him, and he enters the house of the dead girl. One can understand the purity laws as a way of honoring God by establishing some very early public health and sanitation rules. However, by Jesus' time, as we've seen again and again, following important protections had swollen to an utter rejection of anything that doesn't fit within the precise letter of the law. Christ appears unencumbered by such concerns. When Jesus calls out, wondering who touched him, the formerly bleeding woman falls down at his feet trembling. In that moment, she seems to fear the rebuke for passing on her uncleanliness. Instead, Jesus celebrates her faith, as it says in Mark 5:34. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The crowd gives the father of the dead girl trouble for roping Jesus into the situation, as it says in verse 35. While he was still speaking, some of the people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Why bother passing on any additional uncleanliness? Because she died already." Jesus walks right in and brings her back to life. In 21st century America, we largely don't share these specific concerns. We often put the dead on display at their own funerals, and our understanding of women's ability to participate in society has blessedly changed. However, as my example from Kenya illustrates, we simply moved on to different things that impart stigma or uncleanliness. Our pain at seeing a loved one with dementia often keeps us away, depriving them of life-sustaining human contact. We express profound annoyance and attempt to cordon off unruly children or folks on the autism spectrum that don't conform to normal standards of behavior, often cutting them and their families off from the joy of community. In 1969, Mr. Rogers made waves by airing a scene of him sharing a small wading pool with Officer Clemens, an African-American police officer. This pushed back against the long-standing racist assumption that African Americans were more likely to spread disease, and thus the races should not share pools. Now, what do you think Jesus would do in these situations? Declaring someone unclean, imparting stigma, particularly for a condition beyond their control, often makes them suffer twice. They suffer from the thing that hurts them, and they suffer rejection and isolation, a profound pain for an innately social creature. In each of the two miracles, Jesus restores their bodies and brings them and their families back into the social fold. We reject stigma, care not for our own social purity, and seek to bring everyone away from the margins and back into beloved community. We stop developing new weird hangups and never let them stop us from welcoming people. So as you just heard in the piece, I've already written next week's piece, and so this is like 2 weeks of leaning heavily into like, I've seen some stuff, and some of what I've seen, this one is some of what I've seen, concerns me. We, I hear these conversations of like, oh my god, those people in those times, that's so weird that they were so awful, and I'm like, this is pretty bad, this thing, but also we have carried forward maybe like differently defined. We don't use these words like unclean, but particularly in the world of HIV and AIDS research, like we talk a lot about the stigma that this imparts, even though is a highlight in the piece. Like this is just not how AIDS happens anymore. It's not like I understand, and again, there's this also in this country. There's this whole terrible history of HIV. Started its life as gay men's disease. Like, this is a real bad. This is a real bad, like stigma with HIV. It also used to be a death sentence, and flash forward now 40 years, right? We are more than 40 years into this pandemic. COVID was not the first pandemic. It's just where most people first heard that word. But HIV is a pandemic. It still imparts this stigma that rings in my mind very similar to the stigmas that get imparted, right? That if we essentially what I draw is an equivalency between the word unclean and a more modern idea of imparting stigma. That, like, let's hold these things as relatively speaking similar. Then we just keep doing this about different things, right? Like there was this weird stigma that African American people somehow communicated disease more. Just boggled again. Racism, real bad, really bad.
But and, God bless Mr. Rogers. And thanks for bringing that up.
So God bless Mr. Rogers, right? Mm-hmm. Presbyterian minister Fred Rogers goes, no, we're going to display that this stigma, this imparting of uncleanliness upon an entire race of people is utter shenanigans. But again, that was the 1960s in America. We're talking about, modern day America and Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And then the more subtle forms of stigma. I was I brought in the example of folks on the autism spectrum because I was at an Astros game last week, and the young person sitting in front of me, because I overheard conversation, was on the autism spectrum, and periodically, some loud noises, not at normal loud noise this time in a baseball game, came out of the guy, right? It's a lot. Baseball games are a lot for me, and not on the autism spectrum. And the looks that dude got was just awful. And I'm sitting here going, yeah, are all of these noises at the right times? No, but we are at a baseball stadium, friends. Like, what are you thinking you're going to hear? Right? Like,
yeah.
Now batting from the Houston Astros, Maurizio Dubon. Like, we know, like, there's not much auditory you need in a baseball game. Who cares? But when you shoot those dirty looks, like, that dude may or may not know. Different forms of autism work differently. He may not know. But, like, his family knows that they're being rejected in this moment. And now, I find going to baseball games is this amazing time to come together as a city, right? And it's fun to, like, be in that atmosphere of, Houston, which can struggle to feel like a unified city because it's the size of New Jersey. Inside Minute Maid Park, we do feel like a city. We have a thing. We have a shared ritual. Like, it is wonderful community building. And then this family shows up and gets feels a little piece of that stigma, gets to feel a little bit unclean because this young dude shouts out at random. And you know what? Deal with it. Like,
Yes. Well, and there's so many other smaller stigmas that are
Yeah.
out there that we maybe don't even recognize our own bias, or we don't recognize our own. So, for me, the scripture really hits home. The woman who's hemorrhaged for 12 years, as a woman who struggled with infertility for so long.
Yeah.
So anytime that we would, miscarry, 1 in 4 women has had a miscarriage, right? The
Right.
statistics
Yeah.
are out there.
One in three. What is it? 1 in 3 pregnancies ends in a miscarriage.
Right. 1 in 3, 1 in 4. But the number of women that came to me who, when I would, share that story and say, well, I never had the guts to say anything. Women who had horrible stories of like, well, I was miscarrying, but I still had to go to work, or I still had to do this. And
Right.
I'm like, no, you needed time and healing and the support of your community and all of these other things that are available to you, but we don't speak out for that because of the stigma, because it is such a hard time in a time where we need to not be stigmatized, when we need to be supported by our community. Or like seeking therapy for mental health issues.
Right. Yes.
Right? Huge stigma for some people still.
I didn't bring that one into this, although it is the place where in my own life I've probably known the most stigma, or ground up against the most stigma, is because I actually think that is blessedly changing. It is not changed, but it is at least changing. Where, and I think this is where shout outs to the Gen Zs, right? Like the Gen Zs are blessedly in the way that like, every millennial grew up with incredibly diverse television shows on children's television, and that does actually, I think, impacted our understanding of race. Again, not perfect, but like, change occurred. I think with the Gen Zs, it is mental health and seeking treatment for mental health is a thing in that generation that is a much greater solved problem than it even is for our generation. I mean, growing up as a person with, some pretty profound mental health struggles, I committed as an adult who speaks in public that I was going to talk about and do talk about my own struggles with mental health, my, experiences of it growing up, my experiences of it now, that I don't talk about it as in the past tense, but in the present tense. I swore to myself as a teenager that I was going to talk about this so that maybe it is, because in the church that I grew up in, no one talked about it. And so it wasn't clear to those of us teenagers who definitely struggled with it that anyone else had any idea what we were going through. And it was this incredibly isolating thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just remaining isolated from your community does, like you were saying, keep you from getting the treatment, keep you from getting the healings that you need, whether it be mental health or HIV or whatever the stigma may be. Being separated from your community is a disease unto itself, because it does lower your life quality. Mm-hmm.
Well, and to think about it as Christians, to think about it as inherently a movement about connecting people to God and each other, right? If we think about we talk about this on both shows a lot, what is the church? Right? It is not the building, obviously, but it isn't even just a community of believers with a shared belief, right? That is a definition of a religious community, but it is not a particularly Christian definition of a religious community. Right, because the point of a church, of a Christian religious community, and that's the only ones I can really speak to, right, is to be an organization of people who work to connect each other and others to God and to other people, right? That it is inherently about bringing people together, and so then when we take on the practices of the new stigmas, of the new uncleanliness, whatever that may be. And again, I by no means gave an exhaustive list. I just, for once, I didn't write about mental health. I took another tack. But whether it's HIV or mental health or being in the autism spectrum or being a woman who has had the experience that millions of other women have had, but because they're experiences of women, we just don't talk about them. right? We would in the field of HIV research, we would talk about like if they spent as much money on HIV drugs as they did on Viagra. Oh my God, what an
Right.
there would be so many better treatments and so many better things out there if things like HIV and malaria and things experienced by millions of women could get the same as Viagra, Cialis, and those types of drugs, right? Like,
Hmm.
all all of that is just bad, but specifically in the context of Christianity, um, this should feel really troubling to us, and yet also is certainly again HIV is the place that I know this from an academic perspective really well is a place where we've been absolutely responsible for not just like playing into the stigma because just we live in a culture, but like promulgating, like promoting, like helping create the stigma for
Hmm.
whatever doesn't fit within this very narrow band of what we've decided is acceptable at the moment.
Right. It reminds me of, so I was part of a congregation once who I will allow to remain nameless on this podcast, but spoke the words that they wanted to be in a very inclusive place, a very
Yeah.
welcoming place. Um, and so part of my job was to go and to find the people that did not have a church home and would benefit from being a part of this congregation that was claiming to be very, very inclusive and very, very welcoming and wonderful. And one of the people that I spoke with was someone who did not have housing, had not showered for many months, needed assistance fairly often. I mean, it just was lived with all of their belongings in a shopping cart.
Yeah.
And that person's question to me, upon being invited to be a part of Sunday worship, was could they bring their shopping cart inside? Right? Would they be
Yeah.
allowed to bring their shopping cart inside? And as much as I wanted to say, yes, that would be allowed and nobody would look at you differently for that, I knew even that
Yeah.
congregation wasn't ready for that type of welcome yet. That they were
Right.
not quite ready to be as welcoming as they even desired to be. They did desire to be welcoming, but they just weren't ready yet to open their hearts to someone that was that different, or that was that outside of the realm of what they were used to. But that's precisely what Christ did in these two stories
Right.
by
Exactly.
making himself unclean, right? By going into the home where the woman had died, by being touched by the woman who had been hemorrhaging. I mean, that is the point. That is the thing, is that we are supposed to get our hands dirty in ministry. We are supposed to be messy. We are supposed to have the very dirty, smelly shopping cart inside of the sanctuary, right? That is
Yeah.
the thing that we are called to do.
That is inherent, and obviously Christ lives this to the extreme by literally dying, but that at no point is this about our own like at no point is this about us solely seeking our own comfort. Put it that
Right.
carefully. Like there are ways in which God is deeply comforting, and that is also the flip side of this coin. But if we
Right.
think about the like challenge aspect of this, it is that a church space should not be wholly comfortable for
Right.
any of us.
Right.
Not that I mean that like, people should be able to abuse us, although we talked about last week that like, look, the nature of being in community with people is that sometimes, it's
It's just
just,
messy.
broken people do broken people stuff. Like it
Mhm.
just happens, and people are what make this messy. Matthew 10:36 remains deeply true. One's foes will be members of one's own household, and
Mhm.
crime statistics back that up. Um, I digress. Um, but it's not that like you should just hate being there, but also if you find yourself uncomfortable specifically because of the kind of people you are interacting with, you should unpack that. That's a place, right? And, I think for some folks it is the person who's got a specific odor and a shopping cart that, by the way, does need to be protected. Like that, that is often a real concern because homeless folks stuff get stolen all the time, and it can be really a problem. And so they're really
genuine concern. Yeah.
Genuine concern that may not look like much to you, but it is also everything they've got. So, and for some folks, it's about race, and so for some folks, it's about whatever, right? Whatever weird thing we've decided to make the stigma. And for some folks, it is, about rich people, right? Like there's a lot of people who are really mad about rich people who, by the way, also deserve a space in the kingdom of God. Yes. It cuts all the ways, but if we find ourselves in a place of feeling like I am really challenged that this person is here, all I can say is that's probably the thing we need to lean into of oh, that is challenging to me. Why is that challenging to me? And then, you think about where the New Testament wrestles with this a lot is around Jews and Gentiles. This is a huge, this comes up a lot in the show because, by the way, it's what a good chunk of a quarter of the New Testament is wrestling with, including the Gospel of Matthew and John. And the Gospels of Matthew and John are both wrestling with this question of what does it mean that Jews are here? What does it mean that Gentiles are here? How do we navigate all of this? We came from, the Jewish Christians come from a world where some very specific identity markers super mattered. The Gentiles come from a world that in some ways is sex, love, and rock and roll. A really profound, what are the three things that every Roman city needs? It is a communal pooper, it is a communal bath, and it is a communal brothel. And this is the definition of a Roman city is pooper, bath, literally is poop with your friends. I went, in the one in Ephesus, there was a stage for music while you poop with your friends. It's a thing, right? So again, so the Gentiles are coming from this world that is sex, love, and rock and roll. It is wild. And then they're all together of what this all makes me uncomfortable. Yes, it does. What we see in this story is Christ willing to let that discomfort get imparted onto him, in this case social discomfort, the social discomfort get imparted onto him without comment by him. At no point does he even go, well, this will make me unclean, but I'm going to do it. He's just like, daughter, your faith has made you well. Yep. I'm so glad you're not suffering anymore. Yes. And just walks into the house, walks into the house and goes, the rest of you get out of here. Stop. Why are you, go away. We're going to bring this person back to life. And by the way, this is, I brought this up in the opening of the sermon because it has nothing to do with anything other than it is my favorite thing. My favorite factoid about Hebrew culture is that why does he make her eat? In the last verse of this passage, in verse 43, Jesus is and have her eat something. And it is not because food is healing. It is because to make clear to everybody that she is not a spooky ghost. Remember that the way to determine if someone is a spooky ghost or not in this culture at this time is that ghosts don't eat and people do. So Jesus making fun of his friends, eating fish in their presence to prove, no, not a spooky ghost. Am a resurrected human. Again, same with her. She's a resurrected human, not a spooky zombie ghost, and so eat something. But again, I just find this amusing. This is not, I have no grand interpretive point about this other than I love when it's oh, yeah, person back from the dead has to eat to prove human, not spooky zombie ghost.
I love that. Yeah, I like that you brought up that he didn't, mention it. It wasn't, oh, well, this will make me unclean, but I'm still going to go and heal this person. Because I think that there are places and spaces in the world where they're like, oh, look at us, and pat themselves on the back because look at how welcoming we are, or look at how inclusive we are of this person with a stigma or other. But the things and the places and spaces that I've seen that are truly beautiful in ministry are where everything is completely normalized, right? So we've worshiped in a congregation with, so my husband is an officer of corrections in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and has worshiped with former inmates, has had former inmates leading worship for him. And there was not a question of, is this normal? Is this not? Or it wasn't pointed out. It was just, that was the normal thing. That was the culture that was created there.
We ended up in like some study about like reentry to society. And one of the questions we got was like, how do you deal with the fact that you have ex-convicts in your congregation? And our answer was like,
we put them on
not
stage?
Surprised. We just did. Like, we didn't like, and it's not like, obviously, you let those folks, we need to know for reasons, and we're community secret keepers for a reason, and like, but like, it was not even like particularly a secret. Like, plenty of folks knew, and it was just totally normalized. And again, there was no, like, as the person who would have organized these meetings, there were not meetings. There was like a handful of conversations of like, hey, is this going to be chill? And I'm like, yeah, totally chill. And then it all just kind of happened organically. And there was not some big community meeting of, and we're now going to be very accepting. It was just like, we built the culture that said like, yeah, of course. And and then it was just not a thing.
It was just not abnormal at all. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't anything. Like, there was no conversation. There were no meetings, right? This became a very beautiful and wonderful place for this person to serve, who did an incredible job in helping lead the kingdom of God, right? And helping lead this congregation to worship. Without
we just kind of, I think what that church, and we kind of walked into a culture that was already on that direction, and we just had the joy of taking that culture further.
Right.
But I think the reality was that, like, it was like, I don't know, 50% lawbreakers in the building, right? Yeah. Like, there was just like a real understanding that, like, there's gonna be a lot of people with like a lot of weird pasts. And so if you show up and like, my past is really weird, like, cool. So is like the ex-drug dealer sound tech, and so is this person, and so is this person, so is the ex-street racer pastor, right? Like, it's just
not really... one person on the stage didn't have tattoos of some sort or other, right? Like, it was not.
We used to give you, we used to give it to you because like you were
the only person
consistently on stage without a tattoo. And like, I understand that, to some millennial ears that sounds like, well, yeah, we all have tattoos, but like, think about the eyes of previous generations, like, we're all still very strange. And I think it is like, when it just becomes, when it doesn't feel like a program, it just feels like you belong. I think I learned a lot when I was teaching in Los Angeles. I attended Venice Beach United Methodist Church because I didn't have a car, and so it was on the bus line. I lived in Venice Beach, and so it was on the bus line, and so I could get there. It was halfway between where I was living and Santa Monica Pier. To kind of put you, LAX is here, I lived here, church is here, Santa Monica's here. On the audio version, or the people who don't care about LA geography, all that, it's meaningless. But that was my whole life. My whole life was like, other than going to work in Compton, it was LAX to Santa Monica, because I could get there on the bus, or the part of the bus that I could understand. And that church was super eye-opening to me in really cool ways. And so like 50% of the congregation was unhoused, just like 50% of it. And the other 50% was like just kind of like a weird smattering of Methodists. And like the band, there was a skate park that the church had turned their parking lot, one of their parking lots into. And so there was a bunch of skate punks, and they were the worship band. And then there was a gay couple that was clearly like ran the church. They were like 2 40-something-year-old gay men who just like ran everything. And then the pastor was a young Afro-American guy with 2 earrings in his ears. And so this was like 2009. And we've all grown a lot. But back in 2009, like, this is like nothing looks like this. And then at the end of worship, like everyone just like stood around and ate. They were just sandwiches. Like we didn't have a big announcement like for the homeless people who are here, we have food. It was just like, hey, yeah, worship is over, sandwiches.
Woo!
And we would all like hold hands, and even I did, and I'm not a touchy person, but we did, and then we all hugged, and then we all ate sandwiches, and then we all went home. And obviously, like, even then I can process, like, this food is really here for the unhoused folks. But, like, there wasn't a program. It was just, we have sandwiches now.
Yep.
In the same way that in our Spanish service, like, worship is over and we have lunch, right? It was just like, you know, we would, at Grace, we would talk about like, yeah, no, we have a program for food insecurity. It's called Wednesday night dinners, and that we made them free.
Yep.
But like, everybody's eating, and I know kind of, because, you know, again, pastors, community secret keepers, like, we kind of know, like, who's struggling and who isn't. But like, we all just eat so that we're not even like in helping. Because even in helping, there's a way to like impart the stigma where you, especially when you highlight, and we're helping you now. Right. See how we are helping you now. Isn't it so good that we're helping you now? That's still stigma. It's just stigma but you are imparting some help, like, but you're still imparting stigma with it.
Right. It is pretty incredible when you see that's just the culture, though. And we've been parts of those ministries, and we've seen those ministries that work well, that have just said, no, this is just normal. Like, the yelling at the baseball game, just make it normal, right? Like, if they need to be loud, be loud, right? Like, you are still welcome here in the kingdom of God. I mean, if you need to bring your shopping cart in, bring your shopping cart in. Whatever needs to happen.
You need to park it at my office, that's cool. Like, whatever. It is, I think a lot of the, like, the faith, the lived out your faith is just to, you know, slowly over time that we all just learn to look at things that communicate uncleanliness and just go, yeah, that makes sense. Welcome in, right? You know, the one that is the low-hanging fruit on this is young children, right?
Yes.
The like, the philosophy of church that young children should be neither seen nor heard. So here's the problem, right? Okay, so then you're a young family, and it's just one of those, like, you wonder why young families aren't in church. There's a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is the dirty looks when the kids are loud. Like, this is, like, the lowest hanging of fruit, right? Jesus says, let the children come to me, right? Like, there's nothing in the Bible that I know of that says, like, yeah, no, let us exclude the loud children.
Right.
No. And yet, like, I bring it up in the piece. Like, this is, like, again, like the lowest hanging fruit of stigma that, you know, I experience this all the time as the pastor with the young family, often in churches ill prepared for that. You know, there were churches that my wife Sydney stopped bringing at that point, the kid or the kids too, because there was no comprehension that, like, yeah, kid gonna be loud. Even like my mildly less recalcitrant one, my one who got a little more of the obedience genes is gonna be loud. Certainly not my one who got none of the obedience genes and all the whatever is wrong with me.
God bless her.
You know, God bless her. I mean, you know, but like, and so some of this is on those of us with eyes for this, to also help establish that culture of, you know, if people come to you and go, those kids are so loud, you just tell them to deal with it.
Yeah.
You just say, or like, oh my God, that person smells. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yep.
They do. That
Sometimes
odor may be unpleasant
like
to you. It's probably unpleasant to them too.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about all the reasons why they are this way. And maybe we can be one space where, because I'm sure they feel bad about it.
Right.
Sure they do. You know, a fair number of homeless folks in my life, like they know.
Yep.
They know, and they don't love it either. There's a lot of structural reasons in their lives why it's that way. And maybe church can be the one place where that doesn't matter. Or it doesn't matter what, like, you know, certainly the way Jesus lived his life and ministry is, I don't really care. It's it's just like, oh, like you got helped because you touched me and thus imparted uncleanliness to me. Great.
Cool.
So glad. And, I think that the piece I wrote was on the challenge side, and the sermon I preached on this was on the hopeful side, because it's all the same coin of, okay, so great. Because of how Jesus lived this kind of ministry, it does not matter, like, what social category you fit into or don't. God just loves you,
Yep.
right? And I am guilty of being more challenged than hope because, frankly, the state of modern Christianity deeply concerns me 95% of the time. And I am deeply over a lot of how the faith happens in the world. Like, I'm just over it. Like, I'm just over it. Like, why are we like this? So let me give you, here in the last, few minutes of this episode, there is this hopeful side of it, right? So if you find yourself in a socially stigmatized category, which, because of the nature of even modern social stigmas, can be a lot of us, don't worry about it. From God's perspective, from your perspective, your potential relationship with God, you do not need to worry about this. The kind of refrain in the sermon was like, there is nothing that you can do, which we talk about a lot. There's nothing that can happen to you, which is what's really this is about. That none of these women were at fault. Like, but God, even if you are at fault, God still loves you. But especially when you're not at fault, God definitely still loves you. And there's nothing that anyone can do to you that's going to stop God from loving you. It's remarkably simple. We as society are the ones who make it complicated. We as the church are the ones who make it a problem. Like, God just loves you. God just loves you. And God, my prayer often for us is that we can feel the conviction of God so that we also just love people. That we can love like Jesus. And that is not that we should just look at people who are doing things to themselves that are wrong and leave them in that space. Like Jesus, to the woman caught in adultery, he does tell her to go and sin no more, but he also makes sure that the people don't stone her to death.
Right.
Right? Like both.
Yes.
Like there is space to talk about sin. I think we talk about it. It's a frequency and will continue to. This is not to create a faith that is, devoid of moral content. But, I hope and pray that we continue to, there's this. You ever watch the Muppet movie? This is important. I think this is in the Muppet movie. The chef guy, the diner owner, that is like people is people, frog is frog, bear is bear. If people is people, bear is people, frog is people, people is people. This is this is the thing, right? Like if only. I think too much about the Muppets.
Our life is too much like the Muppet Show.
I think that maybe I should have read more of the Bible and watched less of the Muppets. I don't know. But here I am. And a lot in me is from the Muppets, including bear is people, frog is people, people is people. Bear is people, frog is people, pig is people, people is people.
Yes.
Anyways, I swear to God, there's a theological point in all of this. It's not just a Muppet movie. Anyways, if you have thoughts, maybe not on the Muppets, but I'd read it. thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. That is thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. If you want more of what we do in here, it's non-zero percentages about the Muppets, you can find us in a lot of places at Servants Now on Instagram, on TikTok, on youtube.com/servantsnow, facebook.com/servantsnow, or servantsnow.org on the internet. Everything we do here, including the Muppet-related content, is made possible by a generous innovators grant by the Texas Annual Conference, the United Methodist Church. If you want to support this show, and we could use your support, like, comment, subscribe, leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcast, and share. Share these things. We're now on most platforms putting out short form things that are very sharing friendly. Share them with people, and maybe they too can experience something within the bounds of this show, and help make this show more sustainable in turn. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. We'll see you next time. Hey, Kermit!